So this gives you an idea what's happened to the newspaper workforce. Okay, and as newspapers downsize, there's been an erosion of the quality of newspaper content. We see more homogenization of the content, less investigative reporting, less editing and fact-checking. Okay, the content is not as good. Now remember, this same content is then going and being put up on the web. And often when you look at Google News, what's Google News? It's an aggregator. It's taking content from many, many different places, and a lot of it's coming from newspapers. So the quality is gone from the content, and now it's being pushed to the web where they can sell advertising, but they're selling advertising at very reduced rates, so they're not getting as much profit. And there's a lot less time spent reporting, fact-checking, and vetting the information. So a typical newspaper or magazine or Associated Press, there's actually a system set up where things are reported, they're edited, they're checked, they're rechecked, they're published, and if there's problems, they're corrected. This is not always the case on items that are put up on the web. Okay? So in place of journalism, we see a rise of internet hoaxes and fabrications, fake reviews on travel product sites and technology sites where people are paid money to basically put fictitious items up. 5 stars carries $40, 4 stars carries $30, right? That sort of a thing. And you are going on saying, this is wonderful, look at this, right? You get there and you go to the hotel, right? And the hotel's gone. It's not even a hotel, right? Okay, it's a flop house. So this is going on. So sites pay bloggers and reviewers for favorable coverage. Okay, so they're having this information being passed off as journalism that's on the web that is really adulterated information because it is no longer fact-checked or vetted. And who's in control? Well, the shysters, the marketers, the public relations people are in control. The people who, not to bash public relations people, but there are some unscrupulous people out there that are willing to do whatever they can to drive traffic, to drive sales, or to make a buck, right? It's the almighty American capitalism at work. Hoaxes, hackers, bloggers publishing inaccurate information. Sometimes they don't know any better, but sometimes they have an agenda. Okay? And you even have the federal government getting into the act.
It was a press conference without the press and with softball questions lobbed in.
Are you happy with FEMA's response so far?
I'm very happy with FEMA's response so far.
Sure looks real, but those people asking the questions at a FEMA media briefing Tuesday weren't reporters. They were FEMA employees.
Can you address a little bit what it means to have the President issue an emergency declaration as opposed to a major disaster declaration?
FEMA had given just 15 minutes notice before holding the briefing to answer a barrage of questions about the agency's efforts in the California fires. Since reporters didn't have time to get to the event, most dialed into a teleconference on listen-only lines and listened in as the agency's own employees took their place. The Society for Professional Journalists called it an abuse of the public trust, adding, what would the government have to say if reporters began impersonating federal employees? FEMA's parent agency isn't happy either, calling it a stunt that won't be tolerated.
And Brownie, you're doing a heck of a job.
It's yet another PR debacle for an agency still getting over the sting of the Hurricane Katrina response and left the White House both scolding it and explaining to real reporters just what happened.
I don't think that there was any malintent. I think that they were trying to provide information to the public through the press because there were so many questions pouring in. It was just a bad way to handle it, and they know that.
FEMA admits it was an error in judgment, and Perino agrees, saying she figures it won't happen again. She also got a chuckle out of the press corps here by saying it's a practice the White House would not employ. Sagar Meghani, The Associated Press, the White House.
Okay. So at the Chicago Tribune and in many other newspapers, what typically was done in the past when they had large news staffs, they had fat advertising budgets, they would spend a lot of money on watchdog journalism, investigative journalism, right? Well, there are still newspapers doing this, and there are some not-for-profit sites that, like ProPublica and others, that have sprouted up that are still doing this. Smaller than what it used to be, maybe less institutionalized, but even the Tribune, which is in bankruptcy and is struggling, is still doing investigative journalism. There's still investigative journalism being done out there. But, you know, to give you some examples of some of the things that have been as of late, they did a story recently about ComEd and how ComEd was required by law to compensate ratepayers for outages, and the law just wasn't being obeyed. They weren't doing it. Okay? The Illinois legislature had passed this law, and we're seeing watchdog stories also being done by bloggers and freelancers as well. So there is some pickup in the slack for the loss of what's happened at established media, but not enough because it's costly, and there's not really an economic incentive to do this. And really in the past, this kind of work was subsidized by monopoly profits at major media. So what's been done to correct some of this by the media out there? Well, there's been attempts to charge for news, but these have been met with resistance. Forrester forecasts that U.S. online consumers spent $7.6 billion on online content in 2009, and the two categories that were the biggest were video games and music, accounting for more than half of what was spent. In most categories, only a small percentage of the consumers are doing the spending, okay? So people have gotten very hooked to getting things for free or exchanging things for free online, but that is starting to change, okay? So there's a large change out there, okay? So where is it starting to change? Well, it's happening with music, it's happening with apps, it's happening with buying TV shows, and I think eventually it's going to happen also, it's also going to happen with news. So this idea that you're going to continue to get things for free, yes, you will get some things for free, but what you're going to get is a lot of advertising and a lot of things that have run on many different sites before. But if you want quality content and quality information, you're going to increasingly going to have to pay for it, and pay for it on a view or a download basis. Because the advertising is not going to be able to pay the freight because there's too much competition for the advertising, right? So they're not going to be able to get the kind of revenue. So there's going to have to be a mix of revenue from both per view or per use, or what was traditionally circulation, and then also advertising. Okay, so there's been a number of newspapers that have attempted to do this, started it, and then stopped it. I know the Banner Graphic just recently started charging for digital subscriptions. I think if you subscribe, you can get their digital site free, but if you want their online archives, you have to go buy it, right? FT tried this, the New York Times tried it for a while, stopped it, then did a hybrid. The Wall Street Journal is probably among the most successful newspapers in terms of having a large, I think it's 450 or 495,000 paid subscribers. They give you a break if you also subscribe to the paper, but they've been the most successful. And there's other magazines that are doing that, and now you have Apple, right, which has the actual news store and the app store where you can buy an issue, and you can buy it for, in some cases, less than you would on the newsstand, but they're trying to sell either a view or an issue on an issue price, right? So, and same thing's happening with books. So Google, Eric Schmidt at Google is very concerned about this. The reason he's very concerned about what's happening in the newspapers, because newspapers help drive a lot of traffic to Google sites, and they're able to use and repurpose this stuff that's free. So there's a vested interest here in business among some of the big technology companies, because they don't want newspapers to go away because of newspapers. And as citizens, newspapers report and offer a lot of useful information that they once offered for free in terms of about political campaigns, political candidates, listings and services that were subsidized by advertising that are no longer subsidized, which basically means you're going to have to pay more. Right now, well, in some cases, some of those services are going away. So solving the problem, charge for content, new economic models for news organizations. Nonprofit is one thing, where newspapers would be bought by foundations, or news organizations be bought by foundations, which would then invest in journalism and invest in things that are useful and perform a public service and promote the betterment of society, okay? Tax subsidies for newspapers. Newspapers already receive tax subsidies, but there's been talk about loans or tax subsidies to actually bail out the industry, which is very controversial. And that is all I have. We'll all be soon, if newspapers go out of business, be watching reality TV. I'll take some questions. Any questions? Yes, sir.
Yeah, you mentioned that you worked at a major news organization. Did you ever have any government pressure to spin a story a certain way? The example I picked up is like WikiLeaks, they put out some content.
Okay, did I ever have any pressure to spin or taint stories? Yes, all the time. But you know, journalists are in this kind of strange world that they are not supposed to be beholden to anyone but the news organization that they work for, right? So yes, there's pressure all the time, and there's always people that are always maneuvering to get you to write things or to hold things back and negotiate with you for things. But no, you can't succumb to that. If you succumb to that, then your reputation is on the line. And there's a big debate now about whether bloggers are journalists and are citizens journalists and all this, and a lot of controversy about that because a lot of what's happened is when you worked for a newspaper, there was a certain culture there along the lines of what you're talking about, of culture of independence and who do you work for. And many journalists say, I really work for the public. I work for society. My duty is to produce news and to produce content for the betterment of man. Now, I'm saying, you're saying, oh, come on, some of what journalists do is not for the betterment of man. But the idea of their philosophy is they really feel they're truth seekers and they're out to uncover the truth and write about that and publish that. Are they always perfect? No. Do they make mistakes? No. Which is very different from, say, an attorney or a public relations professional or another professional who actually is paid by the client, right? And their duty is to represent the client. They have ethical code and duties to represent them. A newspaper reporter is not paid by the advertiser. They're paid by the newspaper. And any news, if you ever would write about something favorably or move to one direction or the other without any support for that, or you showed bias on a particular thing, you would be fired, right? You'd be disciplined. And then if you did continue that kind of behavior, taking gifts, taking gratuities, writing things or slanting things in a particular way, you would be fired. You'd be removed. You'd be disgraced. Okay? I'm not saying it never happens, but there was that sort of code. Other questions? Yes?
Do you have any demographic data on who reads newspapers?
Okay. Most of the demographic data that I have is that 45 to 65 is probably the biggest group, and particularly over 65 because people have a lot of time on their hands. So as they get older, and there's also with people form households, they have children, they buy a house, they tend to become, some people tend to become newspaper readers and become newspaper readers. Newspaper readers also tend to be people who are decision makers and are higher educated. They have a higher level of education and of attainment in their life. And they want to know more about what's going on in society, which they cannot get on TV. They can't find it on TV, so they want greater depth, so they turn to the newspaper. In general, younger readers are not newspaper readers. And that's always been a problem for the industry. The industry's never been able to solve that, and I think a lot of that deals with a format thing. But, what's going to happen with newspapers is they're going to evolve, and some are going to go out of business, and some will go to new technology, and you'll read it on an iPad or some other sort of flexible type screen. So this idea that you're going to sit behind a computer and read the newspaper, probably is not going to be the way it's going to be, but there'll be other types of technology that are already being tested and will emerge that'll make it easier. And you're already reading the content, a lot of you, that is published in newspapers. You're just not getting, a lot of times, the good stuff because you're not subscribers. You're getting you're kind of eating, you're consuming, from a news standpoint, bites or the leftovers. Other questions? Yes?
Do you think of nonprofit papers, do you think that journalists can remain unbiased?
Yes. Okay. 2 questions. One, what do I think of nonprofit papers? Well, there's been a move to put things in a foundation, or buy things. Probably the best example is the St. Petersburg Times, which was bought and it's owned by a foundation. The founder, upon his death, mandated in his will that the paper be sold to a foundation and that the foundation be for philanthropic type purposes to further journalism and further journalism education. Has it been successful? Yes and no. It's still a good paper. It spends a lot of money on journalism and journalism education, but the foundation has run into some difficulties because of economic times and returns on foundations, given what's happened to the stock and bond markets. Its market has dried up as newspapers have failed, and the newspapers had some difficulties too. But by and large, that is one model that's successful. If you think about in society where a lot of the philanthropy comes from, well, some of it does come from large corporations and individuals when they die. We cannot dismiss that. I mean, we have things like the Gates Foundation, the Carnegies, the Rockefellers, right? After they were robber barons and they made a lot of money, they became boo-hoo, right? Boo-hoo, I got to put some money in a foundation, or I want to be remembered, or I want to have a legacy, and they put it into a foundation when they died, and then they established large universities. But churches, right, started this. I mean, this university here was, think of some of the great universities that, small liberal arts colleges, were started just by the Methodists. And hospitals, think of the hospitals which have changed, which were started by different churches. So there is a role and a need for philanthropy and for nonprofits to run institutions that may or may not be very profitable. The problem that newspapers run into is they're most, in a traditional sense, if you remove the monopoly business, they're not profit-seeking type businesses. So a lot of the people who were patriarchs that ran these newspapers ran them with the idea for the betterment of the community, or sometimes their own personal selfish interests, but often it was for a community type of thing, not to make the most money. The goal on Wall Street is, or with business, is to make money, and sometimes certain things, certain types of endeavors don't necessarily fit with the profit motive. And the argument of this being now is that maybe newspapers are among them, right? If they're going to do a good job reporting the news and collecting information, maybe that doesn't fit well with being a profit-making venture. Why? Well, a profit-making venture writes stories that are going to get advertisers' attention, right? You write for advertisers, and you write to bring in the most throughput, the most hits, not to do the most quality journalism. So bias is something newspaper reporters have always been accused of, but in the old sense of how newspapers and newsrooms are arranged, is that bias is filtered out, I think, to a large degree because of the vetting process. What's happened and what's been removed in newsrooms and in news content is the vetting process. By that I mean there's no longer an editor saying, how did you get this information? There's no longer a copy editor saying, wait a minute, you don't have a quote from the other side in here. Or somebody saying, I read the other day that this is not true. Show me the documents. It's a blogger in a basement, right? Yes?
Sorry, just to clarify,
Yep.
if Bill Gates decided to start a nonprofit newspaper,
Uh-huh.
do you trust that those journalists, like when they were for Bill Gates,
Uh-huh.
talk them up so that they get more?
Well, it's a good question, and there's always things that you should always check your information, and I would always be suspect of information. But if he set up a not-for-profit corporation, there's certain things that in terms of philanthropy, that corporation has to, under federal tax law, has to disclose how they spend their money, what they do. And if it violates the intention of what the foundation was set up for, the government may remove its tax, right? tax abatement, tax ability to tax deduction. It may no longer be a nonprofit, right? It may no longer be a 501c3. So that's kind of the check and balance. If it turns out that this is just a foundation that started a newspaper to promote the interests of Bill Gates and make Bill Gates' legacy look better, it would run into problems. And that gets back to that old check and balance. But I think what you should all be concerned about is if newspapers go away and this public function goes away that newspapers perform in terms of being a check and balance on things, where are you going to get your information? Where are you going to learn about democracy? Where are you going to learn about candidates? Hopefully it's not going to be on CNN or Fox or MSNBC, because a lot of what that is entertainment, right? It's entertainment or just opinion-based commentary. Nothing wrong with opinion-based commentary, but it's not a substitution for the news. It's not a substitution for raw factual information that you can use, right? I mean, it's tainted by its very nature. Other questions I could answer about news, business, anything?
I get the last one.
Okay.
I guess I'm a news junkie. I spend probably a typical day, an hour watching TV news.
So you're more than 56 minutes.
Yeah, and I take 3 newspapers. And I listen to NPR every chance I possibly can get. At the end of the day, the last thing I do is I flip on the Daily Show or the Colbert Report. And sometimes after listening to all this, I stomp my feet and go, why didn't these people talk about these issues? I wonder, I don't know what the question is, but it seems like, how many of you watch the Daily Show on some regular basis? Not as many as I thought. Or the Colbert Report. Sometimes I think these guys do a better job of looking at the news than all the stuff I just watched, right? I mean, they'll go after it. And of course, I get to laugh.
Right.
But they have some fairly provocative questions about what's going on in the news media. And I wonder if you look at that at all.
Well, they provide another voice, and they certainly are entertaining, and it's almost seductive. It's captivating, right? And I don't think there's anything wrong with having that in your information menu. Where I think there's a problem is where that replaces or displaces everything else. So I get my news and I only watch Good Morning America. Well, there's a problem with that. I only watch CNN. As information consumers, as media literate citizens, you need to have multiple sources, and you do. So you may like or prefer certain things over another, but I would be suspect to at anything on the Daily Show as to whether that's actually what happened. I wouldn't want to make a decision, buy a house, sell a car, marry a woman based on what was said on the Daily Show, anything that's long-term, right? I mean, wouldn't you want to check it out a little further than that? Because it's there. It's like, watching Jersey Shore, right? Or something like that. It's like eating a bag of potato chips. I mean, you wouldn't want to just eat just potatoes. Who in here just eats potato chips, right? They taste good, but pretty soon, right? You start, right? And so you have to have a balanced diet or a balanced menu of things you consume. The same is true for media. And the problem is deciding what media, right? What is something that's reliable versus something that's cockeyed, right? I mean, because there's a lot of cockeyed type stuff out there, and can we believe it, right? I think you should view everything that you consume in the same way you look at